Hello, my name is Terrence Rucker, and I am with the Office of History and Preservation, which is part of the House of Representatives Office of the Clerk. We have 20 students in the studio today who are in Washington as part of the Congressional Youth Leadership Council. They will have the opportunity to ask questions of two former members of Congress. Our conversation will center on the role of the committee system in the legislative process. This is the third in a series of webcasts that are part of the Civics Connection, a joint project by the Lou Frey Institute for Government at the University of Central Florida and the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. These webcasts are made possible via a grant from the U.S. Department of Education and are meant to enable high school students to learn more about their government by asking questions of former legislators. During this webcast, our viewers will be treated to several historic documents and cartoons focusing on the committee system. The cartoons are by a wonderful artist named Clifford Berryman, who drew for the Washington Post and the Washington Evening Star in the first half of the 20th century. They come from the U.S. Senate collection, which is maintained by the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives. These documents and many other treasures can be found at www.archives.gov/legislative. We are joined by former Representative Jim Kolbe, who represented Arizona as a Republican, and by former Representative Marty Russo, who represented Illinois as a Democrat. Let me give each of them the chance to quickly introduce themselves, and then we will open the floor for questions. Mr. Kolbe?
Thank you, Terrence. I am Jim Kolbe, and was a Republican. I guess I should say I still am a Republican, but I was a Republican member of Congress who came to Congress in 1985 from Arizona and served for 22 years to 2007. I served on the Appropriations Committee virtually the entire time I was in Congress. And that's what we consider an exclusive committee, one that, because of its influence and power, that you serve on only that one committee. So it's a good vantage point for me to talk about the committee process, particularly as it relates to the money appropriations process. So I'm delighted to be here with you today.
And I'm Marty Russo. I'm a member of Congress from the 3rd District of Illinois. Got elected in 1974. I was considered a Watergate baby. I represented a district that was 2-to-1 Republican, and in the aftermath of Watergate, many of my colleagues in the 94th Congress were elected and weren't expected to survive the next election. In fact, 75 of us were elected in 1974, and 74 of us got reelected in 1976. I served initially on the House Judiciary Committee with Chairman Peter Rodino, and the House Small Business Committee. Then went to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which today writes all the specific legislation dealing with our energy issues and climate. And then spent the last 13 and a half years of my career on the House Ways and Means Committee. Like the Appropriations Committee, it's an exclusive committee, which back in those days meant that if you're on any exclusive committee, which in our days was the Rules Committee, Appropriations Committee, Ways and Means Committee, you could not serve on any other committee because the work on that committee was so important and so heavy that you didn't have time. Unfortunately today, that's not true anymore. But I'm glad to be here. I always enjoy meeting with high school students, and so I look forward to your questions.
We'll now open the floor to questions.
Hi, my name's Joe. I'm from Virginia, and my question is, when a congressman is elected to office, how does he or she choose a committee to serve on? And once that committee is chosen, what's the process for joining it?
Jim, I'll defer to you, and then
You go ahead, and I'll answer the part about how you get on it, choose to get on
Well,
it.
I mean, bottom line is I was a practicing lawyer. I was a former prosecutor, so it seemed that the best thing for me to do would be on the House Judiciary Committee. Then the question is whether or not there's enough slots on the committee for you to make a bid for it. Basically, you have a representative from your area. Our 3 states were Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. So there's a representative from that area that represents those 3 states on the Steering and Policy Committee, and that individual will put forth an argument why you should be on the House Judiciary Committee. And then the question is how many other people are going for it, and then how do you end up getting there? I mean, I can tell you some interesting stories at some point about how the steering and policy process works in terms of how you get to the committee. A lot of it's politics, and depending on how strong your representative is, and are there any other members from the Illinois delegation who are on the steering committee who can garner votes for you. I was fortunate enough that our steering and policy person was one of the old-time deans, which was Mel Price, and Dan Rostenkowski was one of the members of the steering committee who had a lot of influence, and so I got on the Judiciary Committee.
I would say there are 2 or 3 things that go into your selection of a committee. One, of course, is your district's interest. If you're from a farming district in Nebraska, you're going to want to be on the agricultural committee if possible. If you're from a rural state in the West, you maybe want to be on the transportation committee. So it depends on that kind of thing. Second, your own interests, what you really have a real interest. And third, the committee that has the most influence in Congress, where you can do the most in terms of helping out your fellow colleagues. And that, as we've already mentioned, are those exclusive committees, meaning the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Yu, and I'm from California. My question is, what influences a congressman's decision when choosing a committee?
Well, I think basically the things that Jim just said are what influence you. In my particular case, I picked the Judiciary Committee because I was so impressed with the way Pete Rodino ran the impeachment hearings. I thought it'd be great that I'd be on the same committee with someone who helped preserve our Constitution at a time of its darkest days. So that was one reason why I went there. But after I got there, I began to realize that there are other things that you can get involved in that were kind of much more interesting. And for example, I went to the Energy Committee because at the time we had the energy embargo on, we had all the problems we had with telecommunications. And so it was a very exciting time to switch over to the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is what I did. And I stayed there for 4.5 years. In terms of your constituency, being from an urban area, you can almost pick almost anything. Transportation seems to be something a lot of people like. We had enough Illinois members on transportation. I think that's also another factor that goes into it. You may want a certain committee, but you may not get it because there's too many other members from your state on that committee, and so you may have to go somewhere else until there's an opening, and then you can bid for that. You make a move for that committee. But I think Jim pretty much summarized what drives a member's interest.
In my case, I got on the Appropriations Committee my second term. It was generally not considered the case was very weak for a person to get on in their first term as a freshman member. But 2 years before I came to Congress, John Rhodes, who was the Republican leader and had been very active in appropriations, retired. And at the end of my first term, Eldon Rudd retired, also from Arizona. Both of them had been on the Appropriations Committee. Arizona is a state that relies heavily on federal appropriations for water projects, et cetera. And so the case, we made a very strong case to the Committee on Committees that we had to have a Republican on that Appropriations Committee, and that was pretty much the strongest argument we had.
In my day, we did things, you have to have a certain percentage of representation from different regions. Obviously, the speaker can make a big case why everybody in his area should be on a committee, but regional balance, which was critical. I served 12 years out of my 18 years on the Steering and Policy Committee, and my one goal was to achieve a regional balance. Even though somebody was a popular member, wanted to be on a specific committee, if I felt that that region was underserved, I would vote for the person who was coming from the region that was underserved. I think you need to have a balance. You shouldn't have one particular group of individuals overloading a particular committee. So in my day, when there was only 31 of us, versus today there's like 60 of them, the speaker controls just about the majority. So whatever the speaker wants, the speaker will get. In my days, because the speaker only had 4 other people in leadership with him, the rest of us could work whatever deals we want, and the speaker pretty much went along with it. In the event he really wanted somebody important, he would tell us. Other than that, it was all of us doing something for regional balance. For example, you look at Jim, nobody from Arizona on approps. Well, they had to fix that, and so Jim went on it. When there was an appropriation seat open in my second term, the chairman came to me and asked if I wanted to be on approps. I was enjoying energy and commerce so much, I really didn't go on appropriations. I stayed where all the action was.
Thank you very much.
We have another question from the audience member.
Hello, my name is Matt and I'm from Florida. And both of you mentioned your experience with exclusive committees, but you seem to indicate that the process has changed since. And my question was, what committees are considered to be the most powerful and influential nowadays, and which of these committees have the biggest impact on the current economic situation?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that one.
You got it.
As to which is the most powerful committees, it would still be those that are considered exclusive. The Appropriations Committee because it spends the money, the Ways and Means Committee because it collects the revenues, that is, controls the taxes and such important programs as Medicare. Then there is the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is the most important in one sense in that it's the traffic cop. Every bill has to go through the Rules Committee before it gets to the floor. So it determines the parameters of the debate, how long a bill is going to be debated, what amendments may be offered. But the limitations of the Rules Committee is it serves exclusively at the whim of the speaker, and so they don't do anything that the leadership doesn't want them to do. So you really don't have a lot of flexibility in doing things on the Rules Committee, but it certainly is very powerful. After those three committees, certainly the Energy and Commerce Committee today still ranks as a very, very important committee. And then from there on, I think it kind of flows down. If you're interested in money for your district, the Transportation and Public Works Committee still controls a lot of money that goes in that area.
And I think that, and what you see today is these committees have grown in size compared to the days when Jim and I were there. Transportation Committee back then was probably 42, 43 members. It's over 70 members now, close to 70-some members. Just think of trying to get a quorum for a meeting. You've got to get 50% plus one. It's almost impossible to do that. But again, what's happening today versus what's happening in our days, you didn't get on the committee unless there was a slot available. What's happened today, when members run for the first time or when the recruiters go out and try to recruit you to run in a tough district, they tend to promise you a seat on a certain committee. And then if you win, you expect them to deliver.
So they have to expand the committee.
So they expand the committee, and it's gotten to the point where they're unwieldy. You know, my day was, you're a freshman, this slot was open, that's where you went. It wasn't like I promised you a slot. If there was no slot on judiciary, I would have not gone on judiciary. So I think the way they handle today is backwards. They should go back to the old traditions. I happen to be a traditionalist. I don't think you grow the size of the committee. You should shrink the size of the committee. Jim, when I was in Congress, the Telecommunications Subcommittee on Commerce had 7 members, 5 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Today has 43 members.
Thank you.
So try getting a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Russo.
Okay.
Thank you.
Move on to the next topic.
Hello, my name is Robbie Gronowski. I'm from Virginia, and I have a question for you, Congressman Russo. One of the committees that you were a part of, the Ways and Means Committee, has been criticized for having a tax code that is too long and complex for Americans to understand. And recently, Congressman Rangel got in trouble because of this. It was too complicated for even him to understand, and he made mistakes on his taxes. So I'd like to ask you, how did it get this way and why? And also, while you were there, did any congressman in that committee try to shorten it and make it less complex for Americans to understand?
Well, we've tried over the years on a Ways and Means Committee to try to make it less complicated. The trouble is, it's such a varied interest in this country that in order to achieve some result that you're looking for through the tax code, you're trying to encourage activity in the economy. And so you may pass a particular piece of legislation to encourage this particular activity. And what happens is you get some smart lawyers on Wall Street who figure out how to use that to their advantage so people who are very, very wealthy don't pay any taxes. So in 1986, we redid the tax code. We made it tougher. We got rid of a lot of the special exemptions, and we made it a much tougher code. Unfortunately, it's still a big piece of legislation because you take every industry in America, there's some advantage and disadvantage you create within that tax code. And so you're covering a whole range of issues from Maine to California, from Washington State to Florida, and everything in the middle. And you're trying to generate certain kind of activity, whether it's in the agriculture area, whether it's in the industrial area, whether it's in the banking area, you name it. We touched everybody's life. And so what you want the code to be is fair, and at the same time be able to generate the kind of revenues necessary to run the federal government. And every time you think of doing the flat tax or where you get rid of all these exemptions, we once had a meeting about that. The first exemption that comes up is home mortgage exemptions. You try taking that away from middle class America and they'll string you up. So that one we couldn't get rid of. The next one was charitable. The moment we said you get rid of charitable, all the people who depend on charitable dollars come up in arms. So every time you really try to make the code less complicated, there's a whole wing of people out there who don't want you to do that. So you try to balance it as best you can. I'll have to see it more simplified and streamlined, but it's actually very difficult to do that.
Yeah. It just summarizes just what he said. It is humongous. It is unwieldy. It is cumbersome. It is not understandable, and everybody agrees with that. But every provision that's in the tax code is there because someone wanted it put in there. And removing that or taking it out is what's difficult, and that's why the tax code is the way it is.
Thank you.
Move on to the next question.
I'm Adrian Martinez from Riverside, California.
Okay, can you speak up a little bit?
My question is, does legislation have to get passed by all the committees related to it in order to be presented to the full House? And how long does the process usually take?
The answer is yes. It depends on the parliamentarian as to where what committees it's assigned to, and it should be assigned to every committee that has jurisdiction over a particular provision of that, and it should go to every committee. The Speaker has the ability to remove that and put it into the Rules Committee, and the process can take a very short time, like the stimulus bill, or it can take forever and ever, like the energy bill, look at the cap and trade bill that they're dealing with now, which may never see the light of day because of the controversy about it. So the length of time that it takes depends entirely on, its complexity, but more importantly, the politics of it.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next question.
Hi, my name is Audrey Bruce. I'm from the Bronx, New York. And I was wondering, at a time like this, what do you guys think is the most difficult thing about being in a committee that deals with money?
What is the most?
You can talk about the revenue side, and I'll talk about the spending side.
Well, the toughest part of what happens today, the days we were there, is we actually had to pay for everything we did. So if you created a tax break or tax advantage for a certain segment of society because you want to encourage certain activity, you got to figure out how to pay for it. So it's a zero-sum game. So whatever activity you wanted to move forward on, you had to figure out whose eye gets gore to pay for it. And that's where the biggest fights in the committee come from. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm trying to help, say, the housing industry, and I need to take some money from some other part of industry, say, or the banking, say, why am I having to pay for what's going on in the housing? Well, we think at this particular point in life, this is the most important place where we put our revenues in. And rather than continue raising taxes, we look at different loopholes we try to close that we don't think are being as successful as we thought they would be. For example, back in the '86 Act, the investment tax credit was being abused by big corporate entities. And so what we did is we eliminated it. We raised $300 billion doing that, and then we were able to reduce rates, use that money to cut taxes for the average American citizen. Now, when we initially put in the investment tax credit in, it was a great idea. People that we wanted encouraged to make investments were doing it. But then what happened is the big companies figured out, geez, I've got all this tax liability. Why don't I buy the credits from these individuals and I'll use them against my taxes? Well, that's not what we intended it to be, so we ended up changing it. But those are the toughest times, trying to balance where you want to make that decision, who you're interested in helping, and how does it affect our economy as a whole. Because everything we do affects everything we did in Ways and Means affected the economy.
You've heard us describe earlier that the Ways and Means Committee is the revenue-raising side of it. The Appropriations Committee is the spending side. But the truth of the matter is that more than half of our spending is not in the purview of the Appropriations Committee. It's really it's entitlements. It's in the Ways and Means Committee. What do we mean when we say entitlements? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans health benefits. These are things to which if you qualify because you're over 65, you're eligible for Social Security, you're eligible for Medicare. So the spending is automatic, and that's why we call them entitlements. In the area that is the discretionary spending that the Appropriations Committee has jurisdiction over, our biggest problem always is trying to allocate between the various subcommittees who's going to get what part of the dollars. How much is going to go to the Agriculture Committee? How much is going to go to the Foreign Operations subcommittee that I served on, how much is going to the housing committee and the transportation and so forth. So dividing up those discretionary dollars is always the key, and it never seems that there's enough of it. That's always the difficult part.
And in entitlements, the demographics change. That's why it gets out of control. When you created Medicare or Social Security, X amount of people were there at the time. 25 years later, the population grows and demographic grows, like the baby boomers who are retiring now are going to put a huge strain on the system because the system wasn't built that way. When my dad was in the 40s, when they were paying into Social Security for the first time, they paid $50 a year. There were 16 persons paying for every one person that was taking Social Security. Today it's almost 1-to-1. So the problem is we've not addressed the demographic problem, and the reason they don't address it, it's a tough deal to deal with. And so the Congress tends to punt until there's a crisis. My comment all the time about government is that we're a crisis manager. We react to the crisis. We don't prevent the crisis. It's like healthcare. We'll deal with the cancer, but to prevent it, we won't spend the money to prevent it, which is stupid. And hopefully, eventually, whenever this healthcare reform gets passed, preventive medicine will be something we'll do, because you want to keep people from getting the cancer. Same thing. We want to solve the problem in government before the crisis hits. But we tend to be a crisis operation, and it's unfortunate. It's the way we operate. If we went to 4-year terms for House members, which will never happen, you may be able to get more issues done over a longer period of time. But members of Congress, like if I'm from Illinois, we filed petitions already this November to run in a February primary. You don't have your first year in, and you're already running for the November election of next year. So the system probably needs to be modernized, but there's no one that's going to modernize it.
Thank you.
We'll now feature the last question on this topic.
Hi, I'm Christian from Michigan, and my question is for Congressman Kolbe. When you served on the Appropriations Committee, what factors went into deciding where the funds went and how much of them went there?
Well, Christian, let me narrow that question down to my particular subcommittee that I was chairman of, and that's the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which is everything we do in foreign assistance, all of our foreign aid overseas, the money we spend on multilateral banks like the World Bank or the Export-Import Bank, those kinds of things. How we decided, I think every subcommittee starts with what was last year's amount. And the second thing you look at is what is the president asking? And then third, you say, what do the members of my subcommittee need? What do they really want to see happen here in terms of how much money is going to Iraq or how much money is going to Afghanistan? And then you try to make some rational, sensible decisions out of how you're going to spend that money. So I think it's a question of several things. It's the administration, it's the past, what you've done in the past. When I say the administration, I mean the budget proposal of the administration. It's what you've done in the past. It's what the leadership is telling you. It's what our research is showing us. It's what my staff is saying is going to be needed there. And then there's my personal views of where I think the money ought to go. And of course, that reflects taking into account all the members of my subcommittee as well.
Alrighty, thank you.
Hello, my name is Valerie Medina. I'm from Los Angeles, California. What are some crucial characteristics that you look for when you're searching for your staff members? And what can high school students do to exercise those areas?
Well, I think basic thing you look for is education and experience. When I came to Congress and I picked my first staff person, I was 30 years old and she was 24. When I left Congress, I was 49 and my staff person was 30. So as I got older, I became their father. I was their peer, and I became, so at the earlier stages, you're looking for someone who has some Capitol Hill experience, and then you have a tendency to mold them in what area how you want it done. But over time, what you find out, if you hire an experienced person who's done the job, has the education background, they actually help you do a better job. Initially, when you don't know that much about it, you tend to rely on your own instincts. What I find out over time, it's better to have a staff that works with you and they know that they're a part of all your decision-making process. You've brought them into the tent, they're part of the tent, and you end up getting really good staff advice that way. I like unvarnished advice. I don't care if it's bad news, good news. I want to know what the news is. Let's sit down, let's all talk about it. Initially, I wasn't that way. initially was, look, I got elected. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And here I was in the United States Congress, and nobody told me I could ever get here. Now all of a sudden I had to figure out how to put a staff together, what issues I want to deal with. So it was a huge education experience for me. But remember, when you're a freshman member, not a lot of people want to come on a freshman member staff because they like to give someone who's got some seniority. And so after a while, it's easier. But I think education and experience and the person's attitude. I test them out when I talk to them. I want a go-getter. I want someone that's a self-starter who's going to just turn their afterburners on and go. That's who's on Capitol Hill. They're the hardest working people, and they don't get the credit for all the hard work that they do. It's unfortunate. But
I think the median age of people on Capitol Hill work of the staff is somewhere around 25. It's unbelievably young. And the best advice I could give you if you want to work on Capitol Hill on a staff of a member or committee, but particularly a member because that's where you're likely to start out, do an internship while you're in college. Spend the summer, spend the semester there while you're in college working there. That's the best entree you can say, yeah, I've worked here. I know something about it. I know where the washroom is down the hall. I know where the different committee rooms are. I know how to go and get this bill and so forth. So I think that's the single most important experience you could have.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm Cory from New Braunfels, Texas. And how much responsibility do you give to your staff members when it comes to your involvement in committees?
I'll go first and let him go, because I think it's probably pretty much the same, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democrat or what committee it is, though different members have different personalities about that. I relied heavily on my staff because they were following this stuff every day, and the Appropriations Committee is an extraordinarily complex committee, and even after serving on it for 20 of my 22 years, I never quite figured out all the intricacies of how a bill is put together on appropriations. So I relied very, very heavily on them. They also knew where all the bodies were buried, why this provision was in there, the language we had there last year, why we either needed to keep it or why we could get rid of it this year or whatever there. So you rely very heavily on your staff. But in the end, it falls back on you, and you have to take the responsibility for it, and I think that's key.
Well, I think the key is to hire the right people, and then they need to understand your style. Sometimes you get staffers on your committee who think they're the member of Congress. That's a problem. And there are a lot of staffers today on Capitol Hill who think they're the member of Congress, and I think that's a real serious problem. I think the staffs have gotten too big, in my personal view, but it doesn't mean that I dislike staff. My staff was excellent. I had a great group of people, but we worked in tandem. But in the end, they always knew who had to make the decision because only one of them put their name on the ballot to run, and that was the congressman, which was me at that time. So I think you want to make sure you get qualified people, but at the same token, you don't want to make the staff think they run the show. And of course, I made sure they realized that.
Okay, we're about to run out of time, and I just wanted to ask the panelists, what final piece of advice do you have for students who are interested in a career on Capitol Hill or looking into working on a committee?
Well, I think Jim's advice that he gave was the best advice. I have people calling me up all the time, I like to work on Capitol Hill. It's very difficult for a member to hire a totally unexperienced person. So my advice has always been like Jim. I tell them, go get an unpaid internship. You can do it while you're in college, that's easy. But after you're out of college and say you're looking for a job on Capitol Hill, the turnover rate in Capitol Hill today is so enormous. I think the average life cycle now of a staffer is like 1.5 to 2 years. When I was there, I had 10 of my 18 people stay with me all 18 years. Today it's a turnover. So if you get onto the Hill as an unpaid intern, within 3 months, things change all the time. Members are leaving, staff are leaving, they're going to the committee, they're going to the administration, they decide to go back to school. And if you're there, you're here, you're listening, you're like a listening post. As soon as you hear there's an opening, bingo. And then you go there, like Jim says, you've had the experience, even if it's only 3 months.
That really is the key. I mentioned doing the internship while you're in college, but if after you finish college, you decide you want to come and work on Capitol Hill, come back. Take another internship. You say, I've got a degree and I'm going to work in an unpaid internship, you bet. Because it's a buyer's market up here. And I've got an opening, and I've got 300 resumes. I'm going to sort them out. This one's in California, forget that. I'm going to sort them out. Oh, this one's right here on Capitol Hill working as an intern down the hall here. So you're going to put that one aside. So I guarantee you, if you're working in an internship, you will find something very quickly because, as he says, it's a listening post, and also your staffers, your chief of staff and others will be telling you about possible openings that come up.
Unfortunately, we are already out of time. This was a wonderful discussion, and I thank the students of the Congressional Youth Leadership Council for their excellent questions. Of course, I also want to thank Mr. Kolbe and Mr. Russo for sharing their time and expertise with us. We truly appreciate it. Our thanks also to the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives for the wonderful historical documents we were able to view during the webcast. This webcast will be archived on the websites of the Lou Frey Institute at loufrey.org and at the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress at usafmc.org. The webcast series will now go into hiatus for the remainder of 2009 and will resume again early next year. Thank you and goodbye.